Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Boosting Climate Confidence Throughout the Newsroom. I'm Mark Hertzgaard. I'm the Executive Director of Covering Climate Now and the Environment Correspondent for The Nation magazine. Covering Climate Now is a global consortium of more than 400 news outlets around the world, reaching a combined audience of roughly 2 billion people. And we are one of 4 co-hosts of today's event, along with Climate Matters in the Newsroom, the Institute for Journalism and Natural Resources, and Great Lakes Now at Detroit Public Television. Climate change is the defining story of our time. As global temperatures keep rising and bringing extreme weather, and now with a new president in Washington pledging bold climate action, covering the climate story is no longer optional. It is imperative. This webinar will help you get ready, even if you're relatively new to the story. We have a very distinguished group of journalists who will be with us today from across the Great Lakes region. They will be sharing their experiences on how they got into the story and how they learned to find their feet, the challenges they faced in reporting it, and ideas for how you can tell localized stories that will engage your audiences. We'll also be flagging some common mistakes and trying to identify best practices. And of course, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. We're going to frame this conversation around the issues that matter in the Great Lakes region. For example, the erosion along the lake shores, the changing rainfall patterns that are causing difficult situations for farmers, the environmental injustices that occur in cities, and water and air quality issues arising from all this. You are invited to tweet and converse in the chat box throughout today's webinar. You'll find the Twitter handles there in the chat box. We've already received lots of your questions through the RSVP process. Please keep them coming during today's session. We will get to them as quickly as we can and do as many as possible. We're going to pause twice during these 90 minutes. First, to make sure that all the questions are answered after we review the basics of climate science. And then again, after I've gone back and forth with our panelists today, we'll be sharing some resources that can help you develop your own stories before we get into the Q&A session proper. Now, I invite all of you to give a warm, albeit virtual, welcome to our panelists. I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. Jim Angel, he is the former Illinois State climatologist with the Illinois State Water Survey. Tony Briscoe is a reporter with ProPublica. Previously, he worked at the Detroit News and the Chicago Tribune, writing extensively about environmental issues facing the Great Lakes, the impacts of climate change, and Illinois state environmental justice programs. Kelly House covers Michigan environmental issues for Bridge magazine. Previously, she worked for the Oregonian newspaper, where her coverage sparked state efforts to better protect Oregon's natural resources. And Paul Hutner, he's the chief meteorologist at Minnesota Public Radio. Before that, he has spent 20 years as a TV and radio meteorologist in Arizona, Chicago, and WCCO in Minneapolis, where my own father and brother worked many years ago. Jim Malowitz, he's the investigations editor at Wisconsin Center for Investigative Reporting. He previously also worked at Bridge magazine in his home state of Michigan and at the Texas Tribune. And his work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Politico. Sandra Swoboda, she is the program director at Great Lakes Now at Detroit Public Television, and she came to TV after a long career in public radio and worked in print outlets in 5, I think that's right, Sandra, 5 states of the Great Lakes region: Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois, and Indiana. Now, to get us started on the science, Climate Science 101, it is my great pleasure to introduce my dear colleague and one of the co-sponsors of today's event, Bernadette Woods-Plackey. She is the chief meteorologist at Climate Central and the director of Climate Matters in the Newsroom. Bernadette, take it away.
Thanks, Mark, and welcome everybody today. We're so excited to be having this discussion with you. Before we get into it though, everyone on here is a communicator, right? And the golden rule of communications is knowing your audience. And this is an area where there's a lot of misconception on what the audience really thinks about climate change. We know that there's a range of opinions, and sometimes the the opinions that challenge the science have the loudest voices. But what I'm going to do to start out this conversation is I'm going to share my screen and get into a couple of slides I want to show you to really set the stage for who we're talking to about climate change. So there's this wonderful research that goes on twice a year, every year, goes back to 2008 with Yale University and George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication. And what they do is they survey the public on different views and thoughts and opinions on climate change. And they've been able to break it down into these 6 sections of our population across the country. And what you're seeing here is a cut of where people are on their thoughts on climate change. You notice on the left, we've got alarmed and concerned. These are people are really wanting to take action. They don't understand why we haven't done things sooner. They want to know what they can do and how they can lead that. That's over 50% of our population. Now, the ones who question the science, and this is where there's some misconception here, less than 10% of the population, all the way on the right. The doubtful, they have questions, but they're open to hearing about this. So if you tailor your communications to those who are really challenging the basic fundamental science of climate change, you're tailoring everything to less than 10% of the population, whereas you have 90% that wants to hear more, has questions, knows something's happening, but don't know exactly what. You've got well over 50% that want to take this to the next level. The other thing they've done with this data is really downscaled it to communities across the country. And you see everything in the orange and red is above 50% here. This is the percent of adults across the country who think climate change is happening. Everything in the Great Lakes region pretty much is above 50%. You see a couple of little blues popping up there when you get down into Kentucky and Appalachia, but this is where the audience is. And you can take this data, you can go down to your local community and dive even deeper because there's several sets of questions on how they break this apart. Your views on climate change, the views on policies, on human causation of this, and this goes on. And one that I want to call out though too is one of the questions is who hears about this in the media at least once a week? Less than 25% of the population across the country. So we've got the biggest challenge of our time, but people aren't hearing about it, so they don't know what to do. This is where there's an opportunity, because the other thing they've done with this data is they jumped into interest in climate reporting. And look at this. The country wants to know what's going on, over 70% of the population. And this also has a set of several questions that I'll take it in a little closer just to make sure you can see it there, on different aspects of climate change that they want to hear more about. And I'll tell you right now, all of these tested at least 70% or higher. So the thing is, we've got this challenge. People have questions, but they don't know where to turn for this information. And that's how we're going to start out this conversation today, is with the fundamentals of the science. And the most succinct way you can put this is these 10 words from my dear friend, Ed Maybag at George Mason University. It's real. It's us. Experts agree. It is serious, but there's hope. And to dive more into that, I'm going to hand it over to my friend, Dr. Jim Angel. As you heard in the beginning, he's a former state climatologist of Illinois, but he's also done a lot of
We seem to be having some technical difficulties here. It looks like Bernadette's screen has frozen. And so I am going to take the chair's prerogative here. And Jim, Angel, why don't you go ahead, assuming that your screen is working fine. You need to unmute yourself and you should go ahead with your presentation.
All right, that sounds great. Get this going here. So hello, everybody. I'm Jim Angel. I'm a former state climatologist for Illinois, but I've been active in climate change research and activities for the last 38 years across the Midwest. And I also was the lead author on the Midwest chapter of the National Climate Assessment #4 that came out in 2018. And we're just finishing up a climate assessment for Illinois with the Nature Conservancy. So a number of projects going on there. And today we're going to talk a little bit about climate change and the greenhouse effect and some of the issues that come up from that. I would say, first of all, that the greenhouse effect itself is actually a natural effect of the Earth. In fact, it's a good thing because we'd be much colder without it. So you have the sun warming up the Earth's surface and the Earth's atmosphere. And if we had no atmosphere, all that warmth would be radiated back out into outer space. But instead, our atmosphere and the way it's composed is able to trap some of that warmth so that it keeps it habitable for us on the land surface here. I always think of it as kind of like a jacket, so that, you know, like on a day like today, where it's kind of a spring day where we got kind of a mix of temperatures, you know, light spring jacket kind of holds in some of the warmth, keeps you warm, but you wouldn't want to put on a heavy winter coat at this point because you'd quickly get overheated. And that's the problem, is we've got this natural effect that it's always taken place, but on top of that, we're adding on the heavy winter coat. And the way we're doing that is through a variety of our activities. And this is kind of a breakdown of the greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector. And so we've got some of the major ones: industry, electricity and heat production, agriculture, transportation, building, and so forth. And some of these are things that are easily that we can easily adjust or reduce the emissions. Others are a little more of a challenge. For example, transportation, could do more public transportation and conversion to electric cars and so forth. Others are a little more challenging. And sometimes some of these actually are also part of the solution. For example, with agriculture, we can actually sequester or store carbon into the ground, take it out of the atmosphere. So it can actually be a part of the solution as well as part of the problem here. But you look at this, one of my favorite graphs. This is global temperatures since 1880 to present. And the blue bars are below the really long-term average for this period. The red bars are above the long-term average. And what you can see from this right away, what catches your eye is that in the last 30, 40 years that we've seen this steady increase in temperatures over time. And I didn't dig through, in interest of time, I didn't go back, but we have other records that go back even farther that show that this is indeed the warmest in modern history. And you can see that it's a pretty relentless upward trend if we look over the last 100 years or so of warming. And that gray bar that goes through all this, our gray line, is the CO2 concentrations over time. So back in the 1800s, you know, it's kind of in the early part of the Industrial Revolution. And as we go through time now, that those have increased quite a bit. So even from just kind of eyeballing it, you can see that there's a pretty strong relationship between global temperatures and CO2 concentrations. And this is also backed up by theory and climate modeling work as well. So it's a whole body of science behind this relationship. And it is truly global. If we look at the whole globe, this is change in the average annual temperature for the more recent time period versus an earlier 1900 to 1960 time period. And you can see there's very few places around the globe that have not seen warming. There are a few spots in the southeastern part of the United States, but you can see that a lot of the ocean areas and a lot of the continental areas, a lot of the land surface has seen some very strong warming. In fact, if you look at the United States, some of the stronger warming has been in the Great Lakes region, kind of moderates as you go southward from there, but very strong warming across much of North America, as well as Asia and Europe and other continents as well. So it is truly global. Now we have episodes like, you know, what was it, 2 weeks ago in Texas, where we had all the really cold air coming down there. If you look at that, even during that period, Texas and Oklahoma and places like that were very cold, but there are other parts of the world that were still very warm. So those are kind of like one-off events there, but the overall pattern is the same. Now I talk about average temperatures and how those have changed over time. But the other part of the story is that our extremes are changing over time. In this case, we have This graph here is from the national report for the whole US. It shows the ratio of daily temperature records from the ones that are record lows versus the record highs. So when you see the red bars, that means we're seeing a lot more record high temperatures and a lot fewer of the really record cold temperatures. So that's what we're seeing as we warm up, is this shift towards much hotter temperatures, much hotter extremes, and much fewer of the cold events moving forward. And this is projected to continue on into the future as well. Look at model projections out to mid to late century. These really haven't changed that much over time. When I first did this work back in the 1980s, the numbers were pretty similar to what we see today. By mid-century, the Great Lakes region is in the ballpark of about 4 to 5 degrees of warming. By the end of the century, we're in the 5 to 9 degree warming range, and it depends on the scenario and the climate model and so forth, but that kind of gives you a relative sense of how much of a change that we're expecting. So if you talk about 4 to 5 degrees warming, that's the average temperatures. You're going to see big changes in the extremes and things like that. Another way to think of it is that you're basically moving the Great Lakes region southward by about 2 or 3 states. So the Great Lakes is more like Tennessee or Kentucky. And then if you get by the end of the century, it might be more like Mississippi or Alabama. So you can imagine with those kinds of climates, there's going to be a big difference in how things play out in the Great Lakes region. You zoom in on extreme temperatures. This is a study that we're doing for Illinois. We can use the surrounding states as well. This is the number of days at 95 degrees or higher, which my personal threshold for what I would call hot weather. And in this case, we get them now, obviously. But by mid-century in the top or in the left-hand panels there, they can increase by about up to somewhere between 16 to 32 days. And by the end of the century, it can actually be 40 to 56 or more days per year. So it can be much more frequent experience of these really hot days moving forward. So that's especially problematic in terms of human health, and as well as the impacts on crops and livestock and the natural environment. So there's some big changes are on the horizon from that. Now, layered on top of this is we also have the urban heat island and also the urban flooding situation. And with those two, you've got places like Chicago and Milwaukee and Detroit. You actually have the urban environment making the warming worse because the buildings and the concrete and the asphalt hold in warm up more during the day and also retain that heat more at nighttime. So the daytime and nighttime temperatures can be quite higher than in the surrounding area. And also with all the concrete and asphalt, you get more runoff from rain events. So you have more trouble with the flooding in those areas. So that's kind of an extra layer of concern in terms of climate change and climate in general. So a key message is that this period is now the warmest in the history of modern civilization, and that it's the human activities that are the dominant cause of the warming. Now, the other aspect of all this is that as you warm up the atmosphere, you get more evaporation, and more evaporation means more precipitation. In fact, there's an equation out there that for every degree Fahrenheit, you get about 4% more water vapor. And so that adds fuel to any passing storm. And so we get increases in precipitation. This is the annual precipitation across the United States. So those areas in the kind of the blue-green colors there are increases of about 5 to 15% in the historical record alone. And that we're seeing expect those increases to continue on into the future. So we're driving up the overall precipitation amounts, but especially the heavier rain amounts. So if we look at things like the 2-inch rains or 4 inches, those have certainly increased quite a bit over time. And that's where we have the real problem. So overall, it's getting wetter, but the big problem is with the more heavy rains, you get more flooding in both rural and urban areas. And that's actually, at least from my conversation with with people in Illinois and elsewhere, that's probably one of the biggest climate change impacts that we're seeing in the Great Lakes region right now is this overall increase in precipitation and heavy rain events. And we see this, in fact, I was just reminiscing earlier about the 2019 event with someone else today. That was a period of in March of that year where we had widespread heavy rains that caused massive amounts of flooding across the plain states, but also Missouri, Illinois, and these are becoming much more regular events. So the point here is that it's not just that it's raining 4 inches over some suburb in Chicago, it's that there's widespread rains that are causing regional problems as well. And so the key message there is that in the United States, precipitation is expected to continue to increase, but especially the heavy rain events are expected to increase in both the frequency and the amounts. And we're certainly feeling the effects of that already. We did a study back in 2015 called looking at urban flooding just in Illinois. And we looked at about a 10-year period there. We looked at insurance records and other things. There was about a $2 billion losses over that 10-year period from urban flooding. So that's not flooding of rivers and streams. That's basement flooding, parking lots, roadways, businesses, and things like that. So the losses from these events are pretty significant already. And also it's compounded by these other problems. So like in Chicago and elsewhere, any kind of urban area, aging infrastructure, you also have the urbanization, which increases the runoff. So all of these things are working together to cause major problems in these areas. If you're a farmer in the Midwest, you certainly have felt the impacts of wetter growing season. It impacts things like reduced workable field days, you get planting delays, you get replanting, sometimes you can't plant at all. You get issues with soil compaction and drainage, and also nutrient loss and plant disease. So there's a whole host of problems that farmers are already having to address from climate change across the Midwestern region. Also, we've seen a lot of disruption in transportation in the 2019 event. We saw transportation on the rivers and across the Midwest that was disrupted. Barge traffic on the Mississippi and Illinois River in particular, and the Missouri River were hard hit. And that's a major source of moving commodities around the region. It's also, by the way, a very cost-effective and very fuel-efficient way of doing it. It's much more efficient to ship something by barge than it is by railroad, or especially by truck. That's probably the worst as far as the carbon impacts. So it disrupts railway traffic and barge traffic, and as well as road traffic as well. So there's a whole host of impacts on transportation. Also, another one that we have to wrestle with is human health. And this is, you could have a 2-day seminar on this one, because the impacts are so widespread and really impact large groups of people. One of them is heat. Earlier I was talking about the days of 95 degrees or higher. Heat is one of our biggest killers as far as natural events go. And so you get, especially in these urban areas, you can see that the impacts could be quite large. So we had the 95 heat wave in Chicago with over 700 deaths. And a lot of those deaths occurred in our most vulnerable communities. So communities of color and also low income. And so those are especially vulnerable to these kind of events. But it's also a big impact in urban or in rural areas too. We had a study a couple of years ago with CDC where we saw that even in rural areas, because you have a lot of farm labor and again, a lot of poverty in these rural areas, that we saw, if you adjust for population, that the deaths from heat stroke are just as high as they are in the city. And I could go on and on about this one. So health impacts are certainly an area that need to be explored in terms of the impacts of climate change. And finally, I would say that I listed a few of the reports that I kind of touched on today, although this is kind of the tip of the iceberg, but there's the Climate Science Special Report, and the National Climate Assessment. The Great Lakes the Great Lakes RESA, which is a NOAA program, has done quite a bit of work on climate change in the Great Lakes region. And then just the last year or so, the Environmental Law and Policy Center out of Chicago did a climate assessment of the Great Lakes region itself. And then there's a host of other ones. So this is kind of the tip of the iceberg. You know, as far as sources for talking about climate change is the state climatologists. There's also the regional climate centers. There are a whole host of federal programs that also deal with climate change as well. USGS, USDA. There's the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So there's quite a few places like that, as well as a number of universities that do quite a bit of climate change research as well. So there's a whole constellation of sources out there for climate change. So with that, I'll stop, and I think these slides will be made available, so you don't have to memorize these links here. Hopefully you can click on them at a later point.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. And sorry, everybody. We went through, I know, I went through complete failure of internet and power in our neighborhood. And it's actually beautiful today. I live in New Jersey. So with that, I'm on a hotspot, so trying to make this work. And I caught most of that, Jim. So thank you very much. I want to combine a couple of questions that have come in previously and some that we see popping here right now, too. There have been a few that have come up about Great Lakes levels and the huge swings we've had from too much rain to the drought years. Could you dig into that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, so that's one of those interesting scientific questions that we've wrestled with for years, because we have seen big swings in those levels. And I would say that we're still not sure about that one. We've done some modeling work. I did some work about 10 years ago that showed that the lake levels would drop into the future, but then there's been some more recent research with a different set of models that have shown that maybe the drops may not be that bad, or maybe not at all. And part of the problem is that you got competing factors going on. So we have this trend towards wetter conditions that would raise the levels, but then as we warm up the atmosphere, especially in the wintertime, you get more evaporation off of the lakes. So that's taken it in the other direction. So it's really hard to figure out which one's going to win out there. And in fact, some of it may actually counterbalance each other. But I will say that the Great Lakes are very sensitive to both not only the heavy rainfall events, but also drought as well. We saw some of the highest lake levels in the mid 1980s, and then we had the drought of 1988 that within a year dropped those lake levels back down to low levels. And it wasn't that long ago that we're talking about low lake levels too. So there is a lot of variability going on there that I think is just part of the nature of the system.
And with those huge swings, it creates all that erosion along the shorelines, which is a problem, as we know. Another one here that I think we have time for that had come in. Could you in general just talk about the role of the Great Lakes within the bigger Earth climate? I mean, it's not the ocean, but they're big bodies of water. So some of that interaction and whatnot.
Yeah, so that's an important interaction with the region in particular, and probably for spilling on into the East Coast there. But for our region, they serve many factors. One is they're a great source of fresh water. They're probably our biggest, or they are our biggest source of fresh water in the Great Lakes region. So that's a great resource. But also they serve as a moderator of our climate, especially as you get closer to the shorelines. They can in the wintertime, they tend to give us not quite as cold condition. In the summer times, they're a little cooler, so they kind of moderate our temperatures there. So we can do things like grow many specialty crops in Michigan that you can't do if you move that over to like South Dakota. It's the extremes are too wild over there, but we can actually moderate it when the Great Lakes region. The other thing too is that we get lake effect snow, so that's an important factor as well. Here in Champaign, we're out of that band, so I don't experience it personally, but that's a big deal in many parts of the Great Lakes region. But it's also, if you look at the lake health, For example, with all this runoff, we've had especially big problems with algae blooms in Lake Erie and how that impacts water quality and the ecology of the lakes. But also, as we warm up the lakes, we're going to have problems with, especially a challenge for cold water fishes like the yellow perch, and then the invasive species like the Asian carp that may come in and benefit from those warmer temperatures.
And that invasive species kind of freaks me out, the picture, I gotta say. So,
Yeah.
so thank you so much, Jim. Really do appreciate that. And Jim's hanging around if you
Sure.
have some additional questions in
Yeah.
chat, he'll jump into also. So with that, I'm gonna hand it back over to Mark.
Thanks, Bernadette. Um, I just want to ask one follow-up question to Jim, if I might. And this sort of comes from the standpoint of some of my own family who's from Minnesota, who say, hey, we have lived with this cold, cold weather all of our lives. Why is it so bad if we have some global warming? I'm sure you've gotten that question many times.
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, it's kind of a joke. I think at one point, I think it was Russia and parts of Canada were talking about, well, maybe it's not such a bad thing, but it does have big impacts. We're kind of, our environment and everything is kind of geared towards having cold winters, especially in the northern states there. So the lack of cold winter temperatures and snowfall can have impacts on things like winter recreation. That's a big one. And so we can, so there are some pretty significant impacts, but yeah, there are some pluses, lower heating bills and longer growing season as well. So it's not, I don't want to be a negative Nanny and say that, everything is about, everything's going to be bad about climate change, but it does mean there are going to be big changes across the board.
Okay, thanks. That's Jim Angel. He is the former state climatologist for the state of Illinois. We thank you so much, and please do stick around. And we're going to now go through our various panelists. We're going to start with Paul Hutner. He's at Minnesota Public Radio. And Paul, one of the amazing things that I've learned about you, just as we've gotten to know you here these past few days, is that you have actually managed to have a regular program on NPR on climate change for some years now. And I believe that it is currently slotted into the daily All Things Considered broadcast. So can you tell us, how in the world did you manage to make that happen? It's such an amazing accomplishment, and I'm sure a lot of people would benefit from hearing how that evolved.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mark, and thanks for the invitation. About 8 years ago, a little over 8 years ago, I pitched an idea to Minnesota Public Radio called ClimateCast, because I was seeing that there was so much emerging climate science coming out almost on a weekly basis, and also news tied to climate change impacts and a lot of emerging solutions. So I pitched a weekly program that we do we air Thursday afternoons during All Things Considered. It's a 4-minute segment. We've been doing this now for 8 years. I think I did the math. It's something like over 400 stories and segments that we've done in the last 8 years. So we basically take a look at the science, the news, and the solutions around climate change. We're kind of way past, is climate change happening, but we still report on the emerging science. Our newsroom policy accepts that climate change is human caused and it's real. So we focus on the impacts, the regional changes, some of those that Jim is talking about, the news, the climate attribution science. When you see a news story like fires in California or heavy hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, what's the climate science tie there? So we interview experts on that. And then solutions, because we're seeing just a myriad of emerging solutions with wind power, with solar power, with companies who are actually realizing that climate change is part of their bottom line. They're already seeing climate change impacts in their supply chains. So there really is just a wealth of topics to report on every week.
Let's dig into that a little bit more, Paul, because one of the things we like to say here at Covering Climate Now is that climate change is a story for every beat in the newsroom. It's a story throughout the newsroom, whether you have beats or not. And it's not something, with all due respect to our scientific colleagues, it's not something that you can silo on the science desk and really get the impact of what this story means across society. So could you just share some thoughts with us about how to do that. I mean, you sound a little bit like you're kind of a one-man band who is doing this across all these different subject areas. How can other reporters learn from your experience in that regard?
I think the biggest thing that I do and that we do is to try to answer that question for our listeners or our viewers. Why should I care about this, right? How does climate change impact me in my personal life? I'll give you a great example of a story that I did last summer, which dovetails off of what Jim and Bernadette were talking about. We stay at some beautiful cabins up on Lake Superior every year. And we noticed last year that the shoreline was eroding to the point where it was within about 3 feet of our cabin. It was a 15-foot drop down to the lake below. So I did a story about shoreline erosion on Lake Superior and tied it to the changes in ice cover that we're seeing on the Great Lakes. And when you lose ice on the Great Lakes, you lose that winter protection from those waves with the big storms that are pounding the shoreline, and that increases shoreline erosion. So we pulled in an expert from the University of Minnesota, Jim Austin, who talked about that. I interviewed the cabin owner who this last year spent $40,000 to reconcrete and rip wrap the shoreline in front of that. So if you're wondering how climate change affects this person, that's a very real and direct effect that cost this person $40,000. So it's those kinds of stories where we're really taking it out of the esoteric big thing that climate change can seem like sometimes, and really trying to tie it to people's everyday lives.
One more quick question before we move on to Tony Briscoe at ProPublica. Getting back to what Bernadette said about how our audiences really do want to find out more about the climate story, what has been the reaction just in pure crass audience terms? Have you seen that your audience is interested, and is your management at NPR understanding that?
Yeah, I'm really lucky because our managers at NPR do see the value of this kind of journalism. And our audience, a public radio audience, is very curious, very science curious. So they respond very well to this. The thing that's been surprising, Mark, is that our corporate funders have been very responsive and resilient. We have 2 major Fortune 500 companies that support ClimateCast. And again, it goes to the impact that these companies that you're seeing, all these climate initiatives, they're not doing it just because they're trying to greenwash or because it's a PR thing. They're already seeing economic impacts. General Mills, that's a huge food company that's been around for 150 years. I interviewed Jerry Lynch, one of their executives, and he says, you know, Paul, we've been around 150 years. We can't grow cocoa in parts of West Africa anymore. We need to find out where to grow cocoa. We realize that climate change is real, and we want to be around another 150 years. So these companies have come to see this as a real, tangible thing that's impacting, like I said, their supply chains and bottom line. So it's not just the journalistic part of it. There's a really great business angle here if you start digging around and asking companies about how they're responding to climate change.
Thanks, Paul. This is really another reminder of something that is increasingly evident in the science, which is that you're now seeing in peer-reviewed papers that scientists are saying we are facing a climate emergency. That's not just a climate problem. It's not just a climate crisis. This is an emergency. And it's an emergency because the need is for immediate action, because all of these things that Paul's described, and Jim before that, and Bernadette, these are cumulative. This is accelerating. And so we have to really focus in on that. And I'll give one quick plug here for Covering Climate Now. We are getting our news outlet partners, the 450 partners around the world, to do a special week of coverage in the lead up to Earth Day on April 22. And our week of coverage will be around the theme, living through the climate emergency, by which we mean living through it in 2 senses. How do we experience it? What is happening to General Motors trying to grow cocoa in West Africa? Or the person who's had to spend $40,000 to riprap to keep their cabin alive on Lake Superior, but also living through it in terms of how do we survive it. So you can get obviously more information on that at our website, coveringclimatenow.org. And now we're going to turn to Tony Briscoe. He is with ProPublica, and Tony has he's now, as I say, with ProPublica, but started as a beat reporter at the Detroit News, and then later at the Chicago Tribune, where just take us through your journey, Tony. It's so interesting. You kind of got interested in doing weather stories because you were the sort of the low journalist on the totem pole, I think it's fair to say, and you built that up to where you're now really one of the distinguished reporters on environment and climate issues in the Great Lakes. So how did you do that?
Yeah, sure. I had the opportunity to get my career started at my hometown paper, the Detroit News. And, as with any young journalist, you're sometimes going to be assigned stories that other more seasoned reporters don't want to take on. And among those are the dreaded, weather stories. But, it's really interesting. I mean, the more and more I started writing about the, daily weather stories, the more and more that you start to notice that you're seeing these kind of freak happenings that is the first in our lifetime kind of events, record-setting rainfall. And we actually had the opportunity for the National Weather Service to come into our newsroom and really sit down to teach us how to navigate their data and their historical climate records. And then you realize you have that kind of aha moment where it's like, these records go back to the late 1800s. So putting that historical context to say, well, this is the first time this has happened in 120 some years. And then I think it's really, I just kind of grew fascinated by that to really kind of add heft to my stories. And so, left and joined the Chicago Tribune in 2014. And it was just kind of coincidental that my arrival there coincided with this 2-foot rise in Lake Michigan lake levels, which had never been seen before between 2013 and 2014. And I mean, you're talking like, a lake that's the size of West Virginia, rising 2 feet. It was, something that hadn't been seen before in nearly a century of record keeping. And, the same thing that, Paul was discussing. I mean, we saw really unprecedented levels of, shoreline erosion. It certainly snuck up on people and made a number of just different infrastructure problems. We saw Lakeshore Drive flooding. We certainly saw many condos and, shoreline structures that were dealing with damage. And, from there, I kind of pitched the idea, well, I think that we should be, have a reporter that's, on climate change and, how that's, affecting many coastal communities and communities throughout Illinois, quite frankly, on a full-time basis. And I will say that, it's just one of those things where it's like, I depended on, the scientific experts. I didn't have any background in science. It's just kind of a cumulative thing. I did take part in a week-long science immersion program later at the University of Rhode Island, the Metcalf Fellowship, which was really instrumental. But I didn't have any kind of, science background prior to that.
Pardon me, folks. I believe, if I recall correctly, that Jim Angel was one of your longtime sources there. So we're glad to reunite you here. Let me ask, just for the folks on this call who may be relatively new to the climate story, what do you, Tony, what do you wish, what are 2 or 3 pieces of advice that you wish someone or assistance that someone had given you as you were beginning this journey into the climate story that you could now share with others?
Sure. I think that, it was an important distinction to kind of make that, some people are hesitant and, are, maybe climate change skeptics or deniers. And, I think that, in order to gain trust from your readership, attribution is just all important. So when you can, tell people that you're getting this information from the National Climate Assessment, which is vetted by 14 government agencies. You're telling people essentially that this is information that you can trust. The foremost scientists have been working on this. Establishing those kind of standards where, if you are citing scientific research, making sure that it's peer reviewed. So just kind of those discussions behind the scenes. As I discussed, you'll have plenty of numbers, which are very, kind of cool to play around with, whether it's temperature rise or lake level rise. But, I think, another thing is, finding hooks that really just resonate with your reader. Sometimes, anecdotes are better than numbers to try and convey a story. So, I mean, you can say that, Illinois has risen 1.2 degrees over the past century, or you can tell them, about how now we're seeing armadillos in Southern Illinois, which, it's just a very kind of odd thing that just like you wouldn't think, 20, 30 years ago. I mean, you think of armadillos and you kind of think Texas, you don't think Illinois. So just kind of conveying how our world around us is changing. And, I think that goes to another point, which is just like, people can argue with facts and figures, but they really can't argue with an experience. And so I try and find, local experts who can really just convey their experiences. And in some instances, we have really reliable data sets here in the Great Lakes region. Like I said, whether it's temperature records or I did a story on Lake Superior just on ice cover too. And we have Great Lakes ice cover records that go back 40 years, but sometimes, you can take somewhere like Bayfield Harbor in Wisconsin, where they have 141 years worth of ship records, the first date that the, harbor opens and that the harbor closes. And so by analyzing that, that was kind of like a proxy for us to say, well, how thick, how much ice cover are we seeing out there? So there are other ways to kind of get around things and really tell that story, even beyond the data set too.
Thanks, Tony. That's Tony Briscoe with ProPublica. I think we're all going to remember armadillos from this webinar. And this is, all kidding aside, this is one of the lessons that we've learned at Covering Climate Now, that when you can talk about the local experiences of people, whether it be that 2 foot of sea level, of lake level rise, that's what audiences really turn on to. And that's, of course, how you get more attention for your work and just have a greater impact. So now we're going to turn to Kelly House. Welcome, Kelly. Kelly is with Bridge Magazine now, but before she was with the Oregonian. And could you just tell us how you got into your sort of journey to get into this, bearing in mind that some other people on this call are also relatively new to the climate story. How did you get involved?
I am I unmuted?
You are unmuted.
It was always kind of a goal of mine as I was going into journalism, but of course, Tony's story resonates with me. I started covering like chicken dinners in the suburbs of Portland, so it was something that I, bided my time and waited to be well established enough to be able to, apply for a position that was open covering in the environment there. And, of course, if you're the environment reporter, you are also covering climate constantly. So wound up writing, almost every story had some element of climate, whether you were writing about, species, extinction issues out there, or drought, wildfire, water availability. So that was sort of my path there. I think it was always an interest of mine because I grew up as a country bumpkin and I, just liked the outdoors. So I think, I always thought I would either cover environmental issues or angle my way to be an outdoor recreation writer. And wound up on the environment side of things and haven't looked back.
And how did you come from the Oregonian to Bridge? And if you're able to, can you tell us some of the stories that you might be developing now at Bridge?
Yeah, so I'm actually from Michigan. So Oregon was, I had moved there, ended up leaving the newsroom for a little while and got my grad degree, after which it was time to come home. And I wanted to cover the environment in my home state. Was also interested in moving from a traditional print focused newsroom where I had been to the nonprofit side of things and getting a sense for what that was about. So Bridge was a great opportunity. And it has been really interesting to kind of have that perspective of the climate story out west and then comparing it to the climate story in the Great Lakes. I've only been with Bridge for a year. So in the year that I have been back in Michigan, it has been like the environment story has been the water story, which has been a climate story, Whereas out west, I was writing a lot about the absence of water, glaciers receding, and what that meant for our drinking water, what that meant for farming, extreme heat and wildfires. Here, within months of my arriving on this beat, we had catastrophic flooding that caused infrastructure to fail. The high Great Lakes were continuing to wreak havoc. So I think to the extent that people weren't really talking or thinking about climate this year, it was such an unavoidable issue because we've had these really visible examples of it. It seems like, sometimes my editor will be like, get this exposition out of here. We don't need as much sort of introducing people to the concept, which is, I feel like, an interesting change from where we were even a few years ago. But as far as the stories I'm going to be continuing to work on, we at Bridge are currently part of a partnership with Sandra and 2 other newsrooms, Michigan Radio and Circle of Blue, to collaborate on reporting on water in the Great Lakes. So, I think we'll be continuing to report on the climate story as it relates to water. And something that was asked in the chat was about, will there be climate migration to the Great Lakes region? And that, we've seen some of that, but it's hard to put a finger on. But part of our series is really asking this question of, if this region of the world is supposed to be some kind of a haven where, potentially people will want to be here, potentially we will be able to be more resilient in the climate future. How are we preparing for that? Especially if water is considered the asset that might be driving people here. So, in that reporting, kind of looking at the issue of preparedness around water, I found myself, and we have found ourselves as a group, really writing about issues that already exist in our society and in our region and are going to be made worse. Our water infrastructure and infrastructure writ large was already crumbling and outdated, and there have been multiple warnings about it. You add catastrophic flooding and you get the Midland Dam break. You add more water to farm fields that, farmers who maybe already find it marginally profitable. And if you can't get your corn in the ground, suddenly there's an economic crisis there. So doing this coverage has been a really interesting exercise in that point, that climate stories are not just environment stories, they're business stories, they're government stories, they're health stories.
There you have it. That is exactly what we keep saying at Covering Climate Now, that the climate story extends across all of these different subject areas. Really, as we go forward into the 21st century, we will increasingly see that climate change is the story within which all other news stories are unfolding. And you have to have that context. So we're going to go now to Jim Alowitz. He is with the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Reporting. Jim, you're now an editor, but you spent a lot of time as a reporter in your career. Can you tell us about that shift and how that has changed your perspective and approach to working on climate reporting and journalism with your colleagues?
Yeah, definitely. And so the biggest challenge when it comes to making sure we kind of weave in climate into our newsroom, which is very, very small. I'm one of 7 full-time staffers. So I'm shifting over from where I was actually, where Kelly is now at Bridge, which has a little bit more of a robust staff, to a small newsroom. And we depend a lot on student reporters and just our few staffers. The challenge has been that I've shifted during the time when we had a very urgent human need to kind of switch to all things pandemic. And we had to make this pivot to really focus this last year on pandemic coverage. And then also the crisis, some of the crises surrounding the election as well. So a lot of my plans, and I can definitely talk about some of the stories that we're planning to report now that things are somewhat settling down. a lot of my plans to do some kind of hard-hitting climate coverage and environmental coverage that I was had ideas coming into this job are have kind of gotten put off. But so my job's really been enveloped by this urgent human crisis. But it's interesting to think about now that we are vaccinating more people, and COVID is hopefully receding into the background. It's interesting to think about some of the narratives surrounding COVID that could also apply to climate change. The fact that we're fighting a pandemic right now doesn't make climate change any less urgent. And in many ways, some of the narratives that you can look at about how states and the federal government failed to prepare for the immense human suffering that the pandemic brought, or failed to prevent it. There's a parallel story with climate change, and I think I'm kind of interested in seeing if there's ways for us to do kind of big sweeping climate coverage going forward that actually takes a look at that could be seen through the lens of similar narratives.
We last year at about this time, Covering Climate Now did a number of webinars about that. And it's really quite striking, the parallels, even just the phrases. You'll remember the phrase, wanting to bend the curve on the pandemic. Well, that's exactly what we need to do on the emissions for climate change. Some people have said that the pandemic has been kind of like a dress rehearsal for what is a far bigger and more existential threat of climate emergency. But Jim, let's narrow in on the newsroom aspect of this. A year ago, a lot of newsrooms were finding, my God, this pandemic story is huge and it's not going away. And we had to throw a lot of reporters on it, some of whom, frankly, didn't know that much about it yet, and they had to become a very quick study. That's exactly what we're seeing now again with climate, partly because of Biden, partly because of all the impacts around the world. So how are you managing that that pivot towards a greater focus on climate, and what lessons can other journalists and newsrooms draw from that?
Well, right now, I mean, I think, no matter what you cover in the newsroom, whether you are on the environmental beat or another beat, it's your job to provide full context to whatever you're reporting on. And sort of that's the fundamental thing that I'm thinking about when it comes to covering the pandemic or covering climate, is that, because as we've talked about on this panel, that so many beats, so many subject matters are affected by our changing climate, that it's our responsibility, it's my responsibility as an editor to make sure that when I'm editing stories where, changing conditions in society, whether it's, the cost of energy bills, or, whether it's, a water quality issue, a pollution issue, if climate is playing a role in the reason why we're, seeing these challenges that might not, from the outset seem overtly a climate story, it's my responsibility as an editor to make sure to insert that context, especially if there's a potential solution. So I just think, I'd encourage editors and journalists to think really critically when you're editing a story about whether you could be missing something if you don't have a climate angle in there. That's not to say that literally every story has to mention, how many degrees on average we've warmed over the past few years, but it's kind of amazing to sit back and think about all of the nexuses that we're seeing. And so it's our duty to add context wherever we can.
Thanks, Jim. That's Jim Malowitz. He's with Wisconsin Watch of the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Reporting. And of course, we have a lot of those resources, and we'll get to them in a little bit in the webinar at our website at Covering Climate Now, also Climate Matters in the Newsroom and elsewhere. But we're going to finish up the panelist discussion here now with Sandra Swoboda. She is with Detroit Public Television. Sandra, you're kind of, if I dare say, kind of famous for, in our profession, for really championing collaboration, which is such, it has such great potential, and yet, let's be honest, there's a lot of journalists who have an instinctive reaction against it. So talk about that, and maybe why we have to get past that instinctive reaction.
Yeah. Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me. And thanks to all the other panelists. I was making a lot of notes and thinking, what some things we've done well and some things we can improve on. I always learn by being part of these as well. You know, the idea of collaboration in media is really interesting. It's something that I came to in 2014. I joined WDET, which is Detroit Public Radio, as part of, I was a hire, you know, in funding that was part of a collaborative effort called the Detroit Journalism Cooperative. The cooperative was formed largely with backing from the Knight Foundation to cover the city's bankruptcy. And so that first year, we all had an emergency really to cover breaking news, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of issues of community equity, you know, racial equality, racial history, systemic racism, you know, everything that comes into Detroit, along with art galleries, the notion of community, municipal finance. And that really, and we were all very focused on covering the story, but also figuring out what to do. We were all put together and nobody had really done it. And so we were all kind of in the same place of what the heck are we doing? And so there were a lot of honest conversations and a lot of efforts made and a lot of mistakes and a lot of triumphs that really led to us working together on and off over the next 5 years. One of the partners was Detroit Public Television. And so through that connection, I landed where I am today. And I'm very thankful for that because it's sort of been a next step. So, you know, I don't want, it's funny you call me a champion because I literally say I'm making this up every day. You bring your journalism and you bring, I think you learn to channel your healthy competitive spirit that we all have. You know, it's less about beating Kelly on a story because I'm never going to do that. You know, we have a website, we have writers, we have a television show, but I'm looking to do something different. And frankly, I need Kelly House. If you go back and look at our November show, you will see her on camera on a boat with a mask on, floating around Lake Huron, notepad in hand, reporting a story. And she was, you know, very brave to do this on camera during pandemic with a new partner. And so, and I think in all of that, it really combined our resources, her reporting expertise, and our video version of it that then took that story and put it out on our show, on our audiences across public TV stations. We share the digital, you know, we share assets back and forth. But you know, it took, now granted, like I had done some for a few years, but as Kelly mentioned, she was new to Bridge. And so I remember sitting on my front porch having a conversation with Kelly when the Great Lakes News Collaborative kind of was starting up and we were all figuring out what to do, and just having a really honest conversation with Kelly of like, I'll tell you what I think, I'll tell you what I want to do, you tell me yay or nay, and it's going to be no hard feelings if it's nay. And so I think, you know, the beginning collaboration, it's funny, I was thinking the tough part, one of the tough things about these virtuals is I can't sort of pull the room, you know, where how many people have worked on a project or how many of you work at an outlet where you're constantly talking about beating the competition. So it's hard to talk about where the audience is right now for this, but I think, you know, my biggest tip is just try it and be honest about what you want to do, and don't, if somebody tells you no on one project, keep talking, and see where that goes. And because really it's all about, it's not about making it easier for us. It certainly was not easier for Kelly to go out one day in a boat with cameras and have to, you probably had to do things like 5 times for the camera, Kelly, but it, at the end, it created a news product. It created stories, video, multi-platform ways for us to get that information to audiences that serve the audience in the end.
And isn't that the point? We're supposed
We
to be
hope.
serving the audience, folks. It's not about our egos.
Right.
We have a real privilege to be journalists. It's got to be the funnest job in the world. You get to learn every day. And we also have a strong civic responsibility. We're the only institution that is written into the United States Constitution. And we are lucky to be working in a country where, unlike some of our colleagues overseas, we don't necessarily face police repression. So we have a real responsibility to rise above our personal agendas and remember who we work for. And it's not really even our bosses, it's the public. Sandra, I think you have a quick, I'm told, a 90-second overview on tips for collaboration. And I think I've heard one of them already, which is don't give up just because one collaborative idea didn't work. Can you fill us in on the rest, and then we'll go to Q&A?
Yeah, you know, I think a lot of times it's about getting over knowing how to do something. You know, as we move along our careers, we learn our beats. We, especially in climate science, that's a great example of learning the science. And when we talk about collaborating, because it's new, we don't know how to do it. So number one, there's a lot of resources out there. The Collaborative Media Center out of Montclair State University has a lot of resources online. They'll link you to other things. Stephanie Murray there is always up for a question by email, and they have a summit each May, which has been one of the most helpful conferences I've ever been to. I think also, that I'll repeat, like, you just kind of have to try some stuff. You just have to throw it out there with other reporters, some of whom are on this panel, Tony and Jim, that I have talked to in the past, and we'll keep badgering you and we'll find the right place to work together on something. And then, really being honest about why you want to collaborate. What we bring to the table is a TV show that's broadcast on, 30 PBS channels across the region. We have a website where we can share content, and we will share all of our multimedia assets for you to use on our website. And that's sort of my elevator pitch. And then if somebody tells you no, it doesn't mean no forever. We work with MLive Media Group in Michigan. We started out with them just a few months into me having this job, and they were instrumental in an Emmy-winning documentary we did about PFAS contaminations. And we continue that conversation. We had their reporters on to talk about the Midland Dam failure. We've had their meteorologists on our show. They've shared some of our footage. We've shared their stories. There've also been a dozen things that one of us said no to, or we couldn't do, and that's okay.
Thanks so much. That's Sandra Swoboda. She's with Detroit Public Television. And right before we do the Q&A, we're going to go to my colleague again, Bernadette, who's going to talk about some resources. I'll just quickly add, though, the collaboration is a big part of what we do at Covering Climate Now. We try to get all of those 450 plus news outlets working together. And all of you are invited to join Covering Climate Now. Any bona fide newsroom doesn't cost you anything. There is no editorial line except for respect for science. And you can get more information at coveringclimatenow.org. And now, Bernadette, can you give us a quick rundown of the resources, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Absolutely. So speaking of the collaborative journalism, I just put a link in the chat also, because we're doing a webinar tomorrow with Stephanie at Montclair State. And it's going to have, we try to pack in as much as possible. And there are just so many wonderful examples right now, like Sandra was saying. So if you want to learn more, contend that. If you can't, sign up anyway, and you'll get the recording from it. So I agree with you, Sandra. That was one of the best conferences that Stephanie put on. It just really gave you a lot of ideas of how to do things and move forward. So I've got a couple more examples here, but we're going to go through with resources. A lot of them have been highlighted in different cases already, and we're going to follow up with a link of even more, but I want to take you through a few anyway. The National Climate Assessment has been spoken about a few times. Dr. Jim Angel is the lead author on the Midwest chapter, so you can reach out to him with any questions that you have. He's a great source there. And it really just breaks down where the state of the science is. It's the fundamental assessment of where we are in the United States with global links. Now, the global version of that is the IPCC. So that's another one you might want to check out. Gets geeky, but it's where the science is. And if you need help understanding anything, reach out to any one of us. The NOAA Midwest Regional Climate Center is a great resource for information all across the Midwest, as was brought up to the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory, great data sets, great people there. The Midwest Climate Hub from the USDA, Great Lakes Integrated Science and Assessments, and your local universities. You guys live in an area with great research going on. Get to know your local universities, get to understand what they're doing. There are a lot of land-grant universities, a lot of connections with agriculture and food. I know this is Big Ten country. I'm a Penn Stater. I always support Big Ten. So get to know your local universities. The Yale Climate Opinion Maps, we've touched on those a few times. Skeptical Science is another resource if you have questions about debunking myths. They basically take on every single myth and take you through where the state of the science is around that. SciLine, if you're on a deadline and you need an expert in anything, reach out to them. They're a matching service, and they also have this other resource, Quick Facts, sort of a summary on the state of extreme weather events and some expertise on. And as you see going through this list here too, Climate Nexus is another great resource that feeds constant climate news and has some resources also. And sorry, it's not Here we go. There we go. And I broke down a few of these a little more in depth. So Covering Climate Now has a resource section on their webpage also. And some of the recent resources they've added are the basics of Climate Science 101, a lot of summary videos from Catherine Hayhoe, who's just amazing. Reporting guide for living through the climate emergency in preparation for the week of focused reporting in April. And then also a fact sheet on where scientists are with respect to stating that this is an emergency. Going to dive into some of the Climate Central resources, partnership with Climate Matters in the Newsroom with George Mason University in Climate Communication and NASA and NOAA. And what we do, sign up for this, go to our site, themedialibrary.climatecentral.org. We know it's clunky. We're redoing the webpage right now. So better things to come. Just stay tuned. But what we do is we put out a weekly package of story ideas that are grounded in science and often local data for your specific location. So we're doing this weekly. There's a ton of stuff there bookmarked from the beginning of the program, even in 2012. So there's a lot of stuff we can dig into. If you need help with anything, we're constantly thinking about these story ideas because we're putting them out weekly also. We're welcome for a brainstorm session anytime. Do reach out. Partnership journalism, another thing that goes on here at Climate Central. And so John Upton leads this effort, and it's really co-producing, co-reporting stories in local communities across the country. And we can be that science and that data support. You're on the ground. You find the voices and the faces to make it come alive. So we're always welcoming new partners in this if you have any ideas. And then we've got this other really cool tool. It's been more geared at the meteorologists that we work with, but it also applies to journalists too. It takes current weather forecasting API and pairs with current installations of wind and solar that exist in your communities, and it spits out forecasts for how much wind and solar is being generated. There's so many ways you can bring this into stories. It's a big wind day. You can report on how much wind was reported after a storm goes through, or in preparation, even on some cloudy days, it's really exciting to see how much solar is being generated. And it breaks down to different geographies and different metrics. The first one is, the most popular one is cell phones charged. People love that one. And then this is our new exciting news. Next week, it officially launches, but you're getting a preview here. ClimateReportingMasterclass.com. When we had to go to this style of communication where you're speaking through screens, we didn't want to stop talking with you. So we built out this great new masterclass. It is just the beginning of so many more things to come in this platform. But there's a snapshot of some of the modules. They're multimedia modules. You can learn at your own pace. They come with actionable resources. And so stay tuned for more on that. The launch is next week. We're super excited. And great people about what they're doing. Here's some story ideas that you can think about right here and right now that'll be coming in the few weeks and months ahead. So Climate Matters, some of our topics, we're taking on allergies for next week. A longer growing season means more allergies are getting worse. Peak CO2, the annual one, is coming up. The new normals, for those who really geek out with data, we look at 30-year normals with our averages of temperatures and precipitation. This being a new decade, we've got a new set coming out. I've already had some media requests on this story, so other people clearly like the data as we do. Urban heat islands is great here too, because there is that real rural-urban divide. We're diving in and updating some of our urban heat island information for this summer. We have a whole solution series coming out. We just released solar yesterday. Wind is coming up in the next month or two. Electric transportation, which is a huge story for the Great Lakes and Midwest, because as you know, we're seeing old factories where people were leaving because jobs were being lost, growing again with electric transportation and battery growth. So this is a really transitional, cool area to jump into right now. If you haven't driven an electric vehicle, it's just fun. It's a fun story. Buildings and looking at how agriculture and our land use is changing too. Extreme weather, I'm a meteorologist, there's always a story there. And as Tony has learned, and you will learn too, there is a climate connection to almost every weather event that goes on there, whether it's happening here, whether it's a big event elsewhere. We've got the information on our website. Just make that connection when you show good video of your TV station. And then anniversaries. It's a good time to look back and see how things have changed. Some seasonal things, St. Patrick's Day. If you didn't know, some of our key ingredients in beer are at risk with climate change. So it's a great story to bring out. It's not going away anytime soon, but it's a great timely story. migrating planting zones. And this is for big ag, but also your backyard garden. We're seeing as things warm, again, it doesn't mean that everything is awful, but we have to be smart about it, because if we're not, it's going to tip on that side of really hurting us with jobs and the types of food that we were planting in the right places at the right time. So some people look at the longer growing seasons as a good thing. There are challenges to that. You have to be really careful with that story, but if we're not smart about it, it's not a good story. So we have to have the right plants in the right places and the right crops in the right places at the right times. Lifestyle activities, gardening, fishing, golfing, boating, all coming up ahead. And we've already touched on a few of those. Sports, big ones like opening day and people getting excited for actually maybe going to sports again here too. We're going to do some data on that. Running, biking events, and even Little League and other things going on in your community that really touch on families and kids. Health, water, food, social, racial equity, migration, security, energy. These are ongoing stories. And as things advance nationally with this new administration, really dig into what are your local climate action plans? What are your adaptation plans? And those are things you can take to the next level where you do live. And so one other thing here, upcoming opportunities. We just spoke about. We've got another one focused completely on health coming up next week. And Earth Day is coming up. April 15th. That's a great news hook here. It's when the world really cares about the world for a couple of minutes. Show your stripes. This is the global warming stripes. So we've been doing a fun campaign with Ed Hawkins. That'll be coming up in June. The IPCC, as we spoke about, it is a massive assessment of the current state of the science of climate change. It only comes out every 6 to 7 years. It's coming out this year. That is going to be really big news. The first chapter comes out toward the end of July. Climate Week in September, and COP26 is the beginning of November. And that's the International Climate Change Conference, where it's expected that a lot of countries are going to up their ambitions on their to limiting emissions going forward. So that's a really big thing here too. And then we've got, as you've already heard a little bit about, Joint Coverage Week, Covering Climate Now is hosting this Living Through the Climate Emergency that will be centered around Earth Day and Earth Week. And the other thing going on during Earth Week, I should say, is it was announced from Biden that he's going to host a global leadership conference at the White House. We don't really know much about it quite yet, but it's another news hook and a way to connect with what's going on in the world. So with that, hope you have some ideas. We always welcome your feedback, or if you want to talk about more, dig into this more. I know that was just hitting you hard with a lot of them. We will be following up with these resources. So I'll hand it back to you now, Mark.
Thank you, Bernadette. One quick correction there. Earth Day is not April 15th. It's April 22. April 22.
My bad, typo.
Typo. So April 22nd.
Actually, 21st. It's 21st. It's 21st.
No, it's the 22nd. It's
Okay.
always the 22nd. April 22nd happens to be my brother's birthday, is how I know. So April 22nd, and that's also the day that there will be the White House summit that President Biden is convening. That will indeed be a big story because it's about getting the Paris Agreement process back on track on the way to the Glasgow summit in November. We're going to have time for a couple of quick questions that have come in. So I urge the panelists to try, and I'm just going to ask one or two of you. Don't everybody feel like you've got to weigh in on each question. One that's very important and that we have not touched on at all in the Great Lakes region is the role of Indigenous people and tribal nation. Very big question there. A lot of history there, obviously, but also right now the new pipeline battle up there on the number 3 pipeline. How can journalists who are relatively new to the climate story, how do you engage with Indigenous people issues, and is there an opportunity around this fight on the pipeline number 3 to begin to do that? Anybody want to volunteer for that, or else I would pick somebody? Sandra, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just answer that quickly. Collaboratively is like, this is kind of a value of collaborations. I mean, I came into Great Lakes now without any of those connections really. And so finding not only just journalists to partner with, but also, other sources who have those relationships, and to be respectful and not to just do, we don't go out and do a story on the Indigenous community necessarily. We include those voices routinely so that it's not, a thing. Others will have other ideas, and I I'm going to throw to Tony because we were on a webinar on Tuesday, and I know that he has relationships on Manitoulin Island for important stories that were part of his project.
Yeah, we actually did a couple of stories for our Great Lakes High Stakes series on Lake Huron. One of which focused on the tribal nations, the First Nations peoples on Manitoulin Island, which is the largest freshwater island in the world. And the reason that we did a whole separate story was because every community is seeing things that are different, and I strongly believe that one of the greatest things that we can do as journalists is give a platform to marginalized peoples and be open for that story to change. So when I was going to Lake Huron, I was essentially going there to write about lake fluctuation and shoreline erosion and how that was affecting the boating community with 6 feet of lake level rise in less than 7 years. But that story, I asked, Duke Peltier, the Ogima for the Wiki people there on the island, basically what was his primary concern with climate change, and that turned into a whole story of its own. So just being open to listen and being open for your story ideas to change.
Terrific. Another question that came in on the RSVPs. How do you as a journalist stay balanced, stay objective when one of the two main political parties in this country is populated by officials who refuse to acknowledge the science? How do you do that? Jim Malowitz, I see you nodding your head. Would you like to jump at that one, please?
Yeah, definitely. And we're so far past the idea that we should give sort of like both sides of the argument equal footing there, right? But going back to what Tony talked about earlier, that brings up again the importance of transparency in reporting. I mean, the fact that you're not gonna it's not that wise to write a story without providing the receipts, right? So linking to the reports and really describing in depth where reports documenting climate impacts are coming from. The fact that an interesting thing about some climate assessments that have come out have been that they included officials in Donald Trump's administration when he was still in office. So mentioning that at times when federal agencies that not now are under Joe Biden, but in the past were under Donald Trump, we're also giving these assessments. But it really comes down to transparency and reporting, but also describing the motivations of people and making statements. You can still safely include some statement from a Republican denying that climate change exists, but it might be that you also offer the motivations there. Mention if he or she is connected to fossil fuel donors or connected to a fossil fuel business themselves, and really do a good job to provide the full context, the full watchdog context for why that person is making that statement.
Thanks, Jim. Paul, could I bring you in on this a bit? Because there's a related question in the RSVPs that has to do with really local reporting. When your local officials do not want to attribute extreme weather event X or Y to climate change, how do you handle that as a reporter in a responsible way?
I think this whole conversation, this topic is interesting because when it comes to a lot of the threads that we're seeing about people, say Republicans or legislators who don't seem to accept climate change, I always try to look at things that are going on in their districts. I mean, what about the companies that are in their districts that are seeing impacts from climate change? What kind of questions do they have? Bob Inglis, who's a former Republican congressman from South Carolina, is a terrific resource on climate. We've had him on ClimateCast. He's one of the converted, if you will, and he's really good at making angles and arguments as to why this should matter. And as far as the extreme weather event attribution goes, I think just drawing those links clearly by bringing the science into the impacts that people are seeing on the ground in a simple way of doing that. When we interview scientists about why the wildfires in California have increased so much, or why hurricanes like Harvey are dumping 20-25% more rainfall, it may not be a climate emergency today at your house, but when the town of Paradise burns down in California, that's a climate emergency. So I think drawing those links are the best way that I have found to do that.
Thanks, Paul. And I think we have time for one more. And this is my bias. I come from a farming family. My mom grew up in southwestern Minnesota on a farm, and I grew up on a farm in Maryland. And a lot of our reporting invariably seems to have an urban bias simply because that's where the big audiences are. But clearly, how we grow our food is going to be a major issue going forward. So what are some ideas on how to really make urban audiences care about what is happening to their fellow citizens out in the rural areas? And I don't just mean the farmers, I also mean the farm workers. Anybody want to offer some thoughts on that? I'll leave it open to the field.
I can offer one thought, which is that we all eat the food. So I don't know that I would be interested. I haven't seen stats on this, but I feel like there is an audience for farming stories, especially if you bring in that relevance of why this matters to everyone. We are all consumers who drive decisions about what is farmed, passively through our dollars. And we also all, someone mentioned the Traverse City cherry story. I mean, that's such an iconic piece of Michigan culture that I think too, there are certain crops or certain aspects of the food and farm industry that you can really grasp on, that audiences, it's like the farm version of the armadillos, right? Where people are going to instantly be surprised and concerned and, want to dive into the story and then get the climate side of it too, as a result of the headline that says, your Michigan cherry festival may not be reliable in the future.
Terrific. Thanks so much. I think we're going to have to begin to wrap it up here because I want to take enough time to thank all of our wonderful panelists who've been with us today. We paid them huge honoraria to be here. No, we didn't. So thank you all for making the time. We've been joined, and also I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Climate Matters in the Newsroom, the Institute for Journalism and Natural Resources, Great Lakes Now at Detroit Public TV, and of course, us here at Covering Climate Now. And our panelists have been, I think you'll all agree, quite terrific. Jim Angel, who is the former Illinois State climatologist with the Illinois State Water Survey, Tony Briscoe with ProPublica, Kelly House with Bridge Magazine, Paul Hutner at Minnesota Public Radio, Jim Malowitz at the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Reporting, AKA Wisconsin Watch, and Sandra Swoboda, who is the program director at Great Lakes Now at Detroit Public Television. Some of these outlets are already partners with us here at Covering Climate Now. As I say, all of you who are bona fide journalists and newsrooms are invited to join us at Covering Climate Now. We will, if there's further questions that you'd like to ask that we weren't able to get to during this session, we will get back to you. Feel free to leave them there in the chat or email us. And you've seen a huge number of resources that Bernadette showed and Jim early in the presentation. Those will all be on our websites to follow up with. And we really urge you to do that. We welcome all of you to Covering Climate Change, the defining story of our time. We are here to help. And we are journalists. That's the whole secret sauce here at Covering Climate Now. We're organized by journalists, for all of us to do a better job on the story of our lives. So thank you all for being here today. We look forward to next time, and we wish you a very pleasant day. I'm Mark Hertzgaard with Covering Climate Now.